So that first lecture was a lot of theory, so some stuff for you to remember. And lecture 2, I'm going to ask you to do some of this stuff along with me. So if you have to, please pause your video and follow along as best you can. So what are we going to review? We're going to have kind of an overview on the preference settings and some of the more common preference settings I like to use. For example, configuration profiles. We're going to review that. Appearance settings. We're going to look at the layout, and the layout's actually quite important. Changing fonts, and I always joke, for anybody over the age of 30, you probably want to change your fonts a little bit, make them a little bigger, just for your eyeballs. Next, we have our capture settings, name resolution, capture filter options. We're going to talk capture filters, not display filters, capture filter options. And then we have capture options with some examples I want to show you. Then we move on to manage your interface, output and options, ring buffers, that's how we're going to capture data for extended periods of time, and lastly, some common shortcut keys for you to see. So let's get to it. Here we have our startup screen. And the startup screen, it's going to look a little different depending on how many times you've used Wireshark. If you're using it from scratch for the very first time, then this section here, the recent file list, will be empty. As you can see, I had 3 files open. This is kind of important to note. These 2 on the bottom says not found, not found. That means I had a file there that I opened, and now it's no longer there. So Wireshark will check when you start Wireshark for these file locations. What I have noticed, just a little tip for you, that if these files were opened off a network drive and then I went home and I no longer had access to that network drive, sometimes, I don't know why or when, but sometimes when I start Wireshark, it takes, I don't know, an extra 30 seconds to launch. It just seems like it's kind of hanging. And that's why. So the best thing to do is if you do load files from your network drives, you might want to clear your open list. I'm going to show you how to do that. But this is one way to find out if the files are found or not found. Down here, we've got a capture filter. Now, it's very important. I'm just going to briefly say this now, but we are going to cover this a little bit later in more detail. Capture filters. So there's 2 things. There's a capture filter and a display filter. Capture filters will filter out when you capture. So basically, it's exactly what it means. So when you capture a bunch of stuff, you don't want it all. You just want certain things, like a certain IP address. Well, you want to use a capture filter. If you're not quite sure and you capture everything and you want to filter after the fact, that would be a display filter. So this is a capture filter. The reason why I'm making a point of this is because capture filters and display filters have 2 totally different syntaxes and commands. And down here on the bottom, we've got our network adapters, and I'm going to show you how to remove what you don't want to see there and how to configure that a little bit later in a few more slides. But this is what your screen should look like. So take a look at your screen, make sure you have your adapters. If you have no adapters here in the bottom, you may have to reboot or reinstall and make sure WinPCAP is installed properly. One of the first hands-on examples we will follow through on is configuration profiles. And configuration profiles, as you can see, is used to configure and use more than one set of preferences and configurations. So if you want a profile for troubleshooting latency or VoIP or security, that kind of stuff, or application baselining, you can actually create different profiles so the screen format, fonts, and all that good stuff goes back to the way you want to see it. Sometimes you might want to see the delta time, other times maybe the relative time, that sort of thing. So this is a very important concept to get out of the way right at the beginning. So the best way to get into this is Shift-Control-A. That's one way if you're a keyboarder. The other way is to simply left click where you see profile : default. And once you do that, you'll see a list of all your profiles. So from there, you can easily create a profile. I'll show you that in the next few slides, but I just want to introduce you to that concept in this one slide, is the concept of profiles. This is relatively new to Wireshark, so not a lot of people use them, but this is a very good little tip to have. Now, when you do create a profile, what's going to happen is you're going to create a folder. So within the Wireshark folder of stuff, you will actually see things like your preferences, your capture filters, and in brackets I've actually put the name of the files that will be in those folders. So this is one way that it tracks it. The nice thing about this is these are all text files. So you can easily open them in Notepad, you can edit them, you can copy them around. If you want everybody to have the same profile, you can copy the entire folder to somebody else's machine. As long as it's in the right location, you are good to go. When you create a profile, you basically start, as I said before, Control-Shift-A, press the New button, with a little plus sign down here, type in the name of your profile, and press OK. So the very first profile I'd like you to create is called Troubleshooting. I'm going to give you that as an assignment in just a little bit. And you're going to create troubleshooting based on your default settings. Now this is important to understand. Down here it says default settings. So if you currently had a layout that you really liked, when you create this new profile, it's not going to use the settings you have on your screen. It's going to use the default settings. So if you've installed Wireshark from scratch for the first time, then the default is basically what you have on your screen anyways. Now once you go into your configuration profile screen, you'll see there's a path down here, and this is showing you where those files are. So again, I'm going to give you an exercise, and I'd like you to create a profile, real simple little profile called Troubleshooting. So these next few slides will go relatively quickly. These are in the Edit Preferences, or Control-Shift-P. That's how to get there. And we're going to look at the appearance options. We're not going to go through every single one because that's just silly. I'm just going to cover some of the more important ones that you might want to pay attention to. First is remember the main window size and placement of Wireshark. So if you arrange Wireshark in a certain size and a certain place on your screen or screens, then it'll remember that. So that's always a good thing to have checked off. Make sure that's checked off. Open files in. The default is mostly recently used folder. If you are working on a problem and you've created a folder for that problem, you may want to just change it to this folder, and that way it always goes to that folder first. All right, it just makes it a little easier on you. The second two are show up to 10 filter entries, and we haven't gotten into filters yet, and then 10 recent files. So when you open Wireshark, you'll see the 10 most recently used files that you've used, and you've seen that on the start screen. Now we're going to go to the second screen. So this one is under Edit Preferences Layout. And this is an important little screen once you get comfortable with Wireshark. The default is called the pizza box style. You'll see pane 1, 2, and 3. Again, as we go through Wireshark, this will make a little more sense, but it just means there's 3 panes there and they're stacked one upon the other. That is the default. And you can see pane 1 is the packet list, pane 2 is the packet details, and pane 3 is the packet bytes. So even with this 3-pane display, if you wanted to change the default, go ahead, knock yourself out. As you get more familiar with Wireshark, you might prefer one of these other layouts. For example, this one right here, 1, the entire screen, and then 2, 3 right above each other, that's a very popular one that I like to use. So you get to choose whatever you like, and then this will be saved with your preferences. If you do mess everything up, you've always got the option to hit the Restore Defaults. So that's going to restore it back to the way it was in case you've forgotten or just gotten carried away. Now when you go to Fonts and Colors, this is a very important screen. I always joke that if you're over the age of 30, you might want to change the size of the font. And if you have a really big screen or a really small screen, you want to adjust it accordingly. Please do not pick a font that is very pretty and scripted, that sort of thing, and difficult to read. You'll end up with a migraine and you may miss things. Try to keep the font simple and boring. So Arial, Times Roman, that sort of thing. This one is set for Arial 10. So again, you can change that to whatever you feel more comfortable with. This is stored in your Troubleshooting Profiles folder. And then the second thing is the colors, right? Just don't get too carried away with the colors. I had a student once make a mistake and turn the font white and the background white, and took him about 30 minutes to realize that was the issue. He thought it was something wrong with his computer. So as a little simple exercise, again, I'm not going to do a separate one, just for you to do, go ahead and pick a new font, pick a new size, and that's what you'll be using for the duration of the class. And again, you can always go back and change that afterwards. Now we have the capture screen. Now this is really important. So the default interface is the first one that Wireshark sees. Unfortunately, it may not be your network interface. It might be a Bluetooth, it might be a VPN, and who knows what it is. You should manually choose whatever interface you want to use for the duration of the class. So if you're on Wi-Fi, for example, such as I am, you might want to pick the Wi-Fi adapter. So please make sure you pick the Wi-Fi adapter or LAN adapter, whatever you want to use, and save it. Now, the other interfaces will always be available. I'm not saying they're gone forever. All you're doing is picking a default. So when you start Wireshark and you hit Start, you don't have to choose that LAN interface. Now we get into name resolution. Name resolution means Wireshark is going to see addresses and it's going to try to help you figure out what that means. For example, the MAC addresses, right? So the MAC address is that burned in MAC address on your Ethernet, Wi-Fi, whatever network interface you have, and it's going to tell you things like it's IBM or HP or Cisco and that sort of thing. Transport names, that's going to be layer 4. So you're going to talk about TCP or UDP port numbers. For example, TCP port 80 would be HTTP. So Wireshark would say HTTP. And lastly, resolved network IP addresses. This is the one that gets you into trouble. So what Wireshark is going to do is use your current name service configuration on your machine, be it an LM host file, DNS, LDAP, whatever you happen to have, or all of the above, and it'll figure out what the name is for that IP address. Now, by default, I strongly encourage you to leave the MAC address on and ensure transport and IP is off. Why? Because with IP, Wireshark will go and do a name resolution for all those addresses all the time. That can do two things. One, you can have a performance hit on your machine. And secondly, if you are capturing on a pretty busy network, you will start swamping those name servers with requests. That may set off some kind of alert or overflow or attack, that sort of thing, and you don't want to have that happen. So a little review. So for the resolved MAC address, as I said, you can see not resolved, these cryptic numbers, which again you may be comfortable with seeing, most people aren't, and then resolved. You can see it says Cisco, Dell, TP-Link, D-Link, and all that kind of stuff. For the name resolution, you can see that I've got the names being resolved. So you can see it says new host to office, office.office. And again, this is based on your name resolution order and whatever you have on your machine. If you're not sure, please just turn it off. You can always turn it back on later. That's the network name resolution. That's this one down here. The transport is here. So you can see port 80 is HTTP, that sort of thing. So Wireshark will resolve up to port 1 through 1024, and it'll have a list of all those. It also has a list for some other ones, but anything after 1024 is not reserved. So you could have it for whatever application you want, and it's a little less reliable unless you know what you have in your environment. And lastly, the MAC name resolution. As I said earlier, the cryptic stuff becomes things like Cisco. So all of these things could be text files in your machine where you can control the name resolution at a later date. So for now, I strongly encourage you to leave the MAC on, network name off, and transport name off. Alright, the capture options screen, or Control K. So there's several ways of getting here, and I want to make sure you're comfortable because this is what we're going to do a lot of. And you will after this class. This is where you're always going to pretty well start with Wireshark. So if you go to the capture menu, under options, you'll also see this thing called a shortcut or accelerator key, Control plus K. That means Control and K. And this will bring up the capture interface screen. So I'm going to do this one live, all right? So here's my Wireshark, and I'm going to go to capture, options, and it brings up this screen. Now I'm going to just close this just for one moment. I can do Control Shift K, nothing, Control K. Control K brings up the same screen. See that? And you can see I've got a ton of network interfaces. So you've got my virtual interface, this thing, Bluetooth, so on and so on and so on. So this is why it's important to set that default interface on that previous screen. This will also show you if I was doing anything with any of those interfaces, you would actually see some traffic activity here. Now I'm not doing anything, so they're all pretty well flat, but you would see that line bouncing around in a real environment. Now underneath these, you got a little arrow, just going to click that. It'll show you the IP address of that interface. Now if you have IPv6, you'll see that as well. If you have both, you'll see that as well. So this is a really good screen to start from. Now we're going to go through a lot of these different tabs in just a moment, but I need you to just get comfortable with Control K or capture options to get to this screen. So in this previous slide, we saw the capture options screen. Now we're going to concentrate on this part down here. This is the capture filter. So capture filters are very important to get a handle on once you start using Wireshark. Here's a little reference sheet that you can just print off or put aside or screen capture, however you want to do this. And this is not by any stretch of the imagination an extensive capture filter list. This is just a reference of some of the more common things you might want to do. For example, ether host and whatever your MAC address is. A host and then your IP address or host name, that sort of thing. And this allows you to capture just those specific packets that fit this filter criteria. And of course there's ands and ors and all that good stuff, but I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. Some of the more important ones that you may want to use down here is things like port numbers, so port 80, that sort of thing, or a range of port numbers. Some applications might use a range of 700 to 800, that sort of thing, and that way you can have one filter to get all of those packets. Now when you use protocols, you might want to just filter on a protocol. And the reason why you might want to do that is sometimes a protocol might not have the same port number. A good example of that would be FTP, for example. We've got FTP control, FTP data. If it's passive, there's other things going on. So if you're not quite sure, you can always filter on the protocol. And then from there you can move around. The rule of thumb I like to use, and I'll go back to this slide just for one moment. I always like to filter from the MAC address first, layer 2. This is layer 2. Then this is layer 3. So once layer 2 is sorted out in my head, I'll go to 3. If possible, I'll go to 4, and so on and so on. So that is the best way to use a filtering methodology when you're not sure. When you are sure and you know what you're doing, then yeah, you can jump straight to the application layer if you'd like as well. Here's some examples. So we've got ether host, and there's a MAC address, and you can see that we've got these colon delimiters in there. Got IP filters. There's an IP filter, and there's a name. Again, it'll use whatever name your device has, and it'll use your name services lookup for that sort of resolution. So depending on your name resolution, LDAP, DNS, LM host, whatever you have on your machine wins, that's another popular one, it'll use that to resolve that name to an address. Please be careful with names, because sometimes if a name has multiple IP addresses, sometimes you run into issues. So again, use names when you're sure that works. We've got port numbers here. Obviously, we talked about that before. Net is a great one. So if you have servers on a network, for example, 10.44.10.anything, then yeah, we can use a net IP filter, which is very helpful as well. Now, if you're not too comfortable with capture filters yet, there's a really neat way to figure out the syntaxes. When you go to your capture filter, I'll show you this, management screen, it'll show you an example of a bunch of filters. And there you can actually see things like Ethernet address, IP, and so on. You can use that as a great little way to try to figure out the syntax. Down here, you can actually see I can add a filter by using the plus, just like we did in the profile screen. So what we're going to do as an exercise is we're going to create a filter called My Mac Filter. And that's going to be a filter for your MAC address. And I'm going to walk you through how to do that in just a moment. Now on this screen we're going to talk about managing your network interfaces. So this is a pretty important point to put forward when you have a shared network computer. So you have a support group with a laptop and a bunch of guys share it, or you just don't use the support laptop as often, or your laptop as often as you would like for Wireshark troubleshooting. And this is a great way to make sure you don't make a mistake. So this is a screenshot, but as I did before, I'd like to just show you this in Wireshark. So you know what, I'm going to just go back one screen here just so I don't lose you. Capture options, or Control K. There you go. And as you can see, I've got a list of all my adapters. There's a lot of these I don't want to see. Why don't I want to see them? Because I'll never use them. Or I want to make sure nobody accidentally uses one of them. So the best way to do this is right here we have Manage Interfaces, right here in the bottom right corner. Click, and you'll see there's a list of all the adapters. All you do is take the check mark off the ones you do not want to see. So that's what I'm doing right here. All I'm going to leave on is my local area network and my Wi-Fi. So killer's my Ethernet and Wi-Fi is my Wi-Fi. That's the only two I want. So I'm going to click OK. Now give it a moment. Watch this. Bang. See that? It updates in real time. So all I see is 2. This is also important if you have a desktop or a laptop with 2 Ethernet adapters. You might want to make sure one of them is always dedicated for capture and the other one might be for surfing, emails, and that sort of thing as well. So this is a very important little concept to get down pat right off the gate. If you only have one interface, this is a moot point, but for the people who have more than one interface, this is something that you really need to pay attention to. One last little note about this screen. depending on the version of Wireshark, sometimes when you update your Wireshark software, this all gets lost and you might have to do it again. Just a point of note. Now, I know this is a fundamentals course, but capturing packets and worrying about long-term captures is something you should be thinking about right now. And this is something that catches people off guard later on because they feel this is an advanced topic, but it's not. It's not. So one thing you need to pay attention to is when you capture your packets under capture interfaces, you'll see a tab that says output. We haven't gone there yet, and this is where it is. Now you can actually put a file name there. Now if you just put a file name there and you hit start and stop capture, what that does for you, which is kind of helpful, it will actually save that file for you in advance. Otherwise you would normally go start, stop, save. This is just letting you do the save ahead of time. Why is that helpful? So you don't forget. You can save your work, so you don't forget to do that. But then the other good one, this is a little hidden trick. If your Wireshark crashes for whatever reason, so you're working away, your machine's overloaded, and bang, Wireshark's not happy and goes away, well, it would have saved that file. There's a very good chance it would have saved that file. So that's a really good one. Now, if you don't have a file name there, Wireshark creates a temporary file anyways, and you'll see that in your status bar. But that's where you control that, right here. The other one is how many files you want to capture. Now this is where we start talking about some I don't know, terminology called file sets, and the other one is called a ring buffer. And those are just two words I'm going to banter about right now just to get it out of the way, and it'll come back a little bit later. So what this does is when I create my, in this case, a file set, number of files, you'll see that a bunch of files get created in a folder wherever you happen to put it. But file sets can be viewed in Wireshark. So if you go to File in Wireshark, you can actually see an option. Let me just show it to you. File set. You see that? Now I don't have any, so these are all grayed out. But if I did have a file set, 5, 10, 15, 20 files, it would actually bring them up here. It would give you the name you gave it, show you that, then these sequential numbers, and then the year, month, day, hours, minutes, seconds, that sort of thing. And it even tells you when it was created and when it was modified or saved. And that way you can actually see which file you want to work on. This is incredibly helpful when you do capture long term. So this is, I'm saying this again, this is something you need to think about now as you get comfortable with Wireshark, so in the future when you need it, it's just bang, easy to do. Okay, you don't have to figure this out later. Now the other thing, under the Options tab, you can actually stop the capture. So at the very beginning on that previous slide, if I did have a file created every megabyte, for example, and I had 30 files, well then 30 files will always be used. Now when I have a 31st file being created, it'll just overwrite the first one. So I always have the last 30 files. That's the best way of remembering this, the last 30 files. This allows me to stop the capture. So if I said stop the capture after 30 files, for example, I would have the first 30 files, and then Wireshark would stop capturing altogether. So this first example, there is no stop trigger, so it just runs literally forever, but I have the last number of files that you specified in your ring buffer. And over here, you can stop that ring buffer. Now, if you chose several different, I'm going to call them triggers right now, or criterias, it's the first one that's met. Okay, so please be careful if you use more than one, or if you accidentally pick more than one. That's going to bite you later. So just one last note about ring buffers. So here we have our files being created, file 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I have a ring buffer set for 5 files. Now, technically speaking, and I'm being very careful how I say this, you're going to miss data. So when file 2 gets stopped and saved, and file 3 starts, you do have a point in time where you may have missed a packet, 1,000, 1,000,000, who knows how many packets. It all depends how busy the network was and how fast it takes your machine to stop and save and start a capture again. Now, if you're just watching Sally Jane's computer as she surfs the internet and just doing everyday kind of stuff, chances are you might not miss any. But in the future, when you do have a busy network and a busy server and you do these captures with these ring buffers, just keep it in mind that you're probably going to miss stuff in between them. So if you try to merge them, which we're going to talk about later, if I was to merge files 2, 3, and 4 later, Wireshark might erroneously complain about missing packets, that sort of thing, when in fact they're not missing, you just didn't capture them. The other thing to worry about here is when you use a network adapter that's not built into your laptop or your desktop, and you opt for those USB Ethernet adapters. Again, USB adapters, they could be version 1, version 2, who knows, and you don't really know how they're going to behave. So try to avoid capturing from USB adapters unless you know exactly how they behave and you've tested them all out, and try to avoid saving files to flash drives, portable hard drives, or network drives. Save everything local to your machine first, then copy it off somewhere else. So here's another reference sheet that I put together for you. It's the most common shortcut or accelerator keys. They're also called accelerator keys in Wireshark. Don't let that throw you. They're just shortcut keys, combination of keys that do stuff for you. They're not macros, right? They're not macros. Macros implies there's some code written that you can edit and modify or do your own kind of thing. These are just shortcut keys. So for example, everybody knows this in Windows. Control O opens. That's kind of the universal sequence of keys you use to open a file, or Control W to close the file, Control S to save a file. Now all these keys obviously work in Wireshark as well, but there are some Wireshark specific stuff. For example, Shift Control P or Control Shift P brings you back to the preferences screen where we were a little earlier. Capture options is Control K. That's a really important one to use. Once you start capturing stuff, Control E is a dual purpose set of keys. Control E will end, which is easy to remember, E for end, but it also starts the capture as well. So think of it like a toggle, start, stop, or stop, start, start, stop, however you want to remember it. And then lastly is a restart, which we're going to talk about in just another slide or two, which is completely different than start or stop.